All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Like he said, I'm from the NRCS, an urban conservationist in Lexington. It's a new position that the NRCS just created back in the fall. We've had one in Louisville in the past, Kurt Mason. Maybe any of you know him. He retired, and they are in the process of hiring a new one in Louisville as well. So there'll be two of us in Kentucky. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of who we are and then some of what we do in terms of technical assistance, financial assistance. And we're not just for large farmers, and so that's kind of the scale since obviously this is a homesteader symposium. There is ways we can help you all as well, even if you're not growing to sell the crops or to sell your livestock. That's not a requirement for our programs. So when you say USDA, I'm sure a lot of you have different things, different thoughts in your mind. It could be the inspectors at the meat packing places. It could be the inspectors at the ports, making sure the invasive insects or diseases don't come in the country. There's lots of things. And this year, just you don't see the information, just to give you a scale of who USDA is. There's 29 offices and agencies in the United States Department of Agriculture. And we're just one small part on that diagram there, NRCS, or Natural Resources Conservation Service. So who are we? Well, we were founded back in the 1930s, and because, as you can see in that picture there, it was the Dust Bowl. It's a pretty famous event. We had a lot of bare soil out there in the western part of the United States that was just blowing away and causing a lot of, obviously economical and natural disaster situations. And so we were formed because of that. What our mission is really to be able to deliver conservation solutions both to agriculture producers and to forest owners. So forest owners are included as well. And our motto has been for many years, helping people help the land. So, some of our core values that, make up who we are as an agency, first is we're a voluntary agency. So we're not here to be regulatory in any way. You come to us for assistance, and we come to your farm because you've asked us to be there. Also, science, of course, is a big part of that. We take our conservation knowledge and we update it as science changes and is updated. We're site-specific, so we come to your operation. We see, okay, what kind of land do you have? What are you growing, and what's your concerns? Why you need our help? We try to do a systems approach. We try to look at, okay, for instance, you've got soil erosion on your field because it's bare. It's also causing sediment to get into your water, maybe a stream next door. So we try to look at it from a broad perspective. And then we also try to work on a watershed basis or in a landscape area, because obviously it's easier to fix a problem if more people are involved. So we encourage cooperation if possible. And then last, local partnerships is a big part of what we do. A prime example is the Conservation District. Each county in Kentucky has one. So if you're not familiar with them, a lot of times they're located with us in our offices, and it's one of our closest partners. They're locally elected government officials, and so you might see them on your ballot as well. And then there's just some other examples. We work with other federal agencies. We work with non-government organizations like American Farmland Trust that was out in the lobby earlier. We work with them. So that's the key for us to be able to get conservation on the ground, is have many, many partners, because we couldn't do it by ourselves. So there's two main things that we do to assist people like yourselves. One is conservation technical assistance. And so what that is basically providing that information when we come out to your farm. So like I gave the example earlier, maybe you have a field that you're growing vegetables on. It's a little bit steep and it's bare in the wintertime, so all of a sudden now you have soil erosion because it's bare. So we're evaluating those kinds of resource concerns to see what you have, and also listen to what you're trying to do and come up with a conservation plan that makes sense for you and that you would like to adopt. So when I say conservation technical assistance, we call it the 9 steps of planning. And so you see there we got what I would call eggs for each of the 3 phases. So the green egg there is basically that phase where I come out to your farm and we evaluate your resource concerns. We listen to you and say, okay, what's going on? Are you trying to grow a certain crop? Or do you have a certain problem you think we can help you with? So that first phase is kind of gathering information to come up with what the problem is. Then we moved to phase 2 there, the blue egg, and that's where we developed that conservation plan I was talking about. So, for example, okay, we say we got soil erosion. Well, I'm going to recommend a conservation practice called cover crop. So that way it will cover that bare soil through the winter time, and now you don't have soil erosion, hopefully. And of course, we would develop all kinds of practices, but that's just an example. You decide, okay, I'd like to adopt that conservation plan, and then at that point we move to phase 3 there, the red egg, and that's where we actually try to implement the plan. And that's where the financial assistance could come in that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. And that way you can implement, whether it's cover crop, figure out how do I put the cover crop on, what kind do I want to choose, how much is it going to cost, the benefits of it, maybe besides just soil erosion. Those will all be part of that conservation plan. And of course the last step is evaluating it. Well, did it work? Do we need to go back and maybe do something else a little different? So when you talk about resource concerns, I mentioned briefly, there's all kinds of them there you can see on the slide. You got soil types of erosion concern, or erosion, water, which could be like water quality issues, air quality, degraded plants, and then you've got 2 kinds of animals, whether it's livestock or wildlife, and then energy, and we always also consider the human aspect in terms of economics and social. So I put this on here because, as talk about homesteaders, and there's a lot, I'm an urban conservationist now in the position I'm in, but there's a lot, even if you're not in an urban setting, there's a lot of commonalities there between if somebody at small scale, regardless of where you're located. And so a lot of the same things that they're interested in the urban area would apply out in the country. So example, maybe you want a high tunnel so you can extend your growing season and grow throughout the winter. Or maybe you want to learn how to compost or cover crops or pollinators. All those things, in an urban setting is just as important as small scale in the country. And those are all things NRCS can help you with as we develop a conservation plan. Now, some of the things USDA, we're always so wide, we've been focused so much on larger operations historically, and so they're making efforts to try to work with small scale producers. And so this slide here is just showing you an example of something that's on our website, and you can get the web address later when the slides are provided, but it's these small solutions for small scale farms, and they have these fact sheets, and there's 49 of them, and I just used cover crops as an example so you all could see what they look like. But this is just a good introduction to some of the things that you may have problems on your land that we could help you with. And so you can see there, it just talks about, what's the problems I'm having, and then what are cover crops, what do they look like, and then what's the benefits. There's lots of benefits, whether it's organic matter improvement or, could be pollinator habitat because you plant one that's good for pollinators like buckwheat or crimson clover, and or just the soil erosion we was talking about earlier. And then it talks about examples of some benefits, associated costs. And so these fact sheets have all this different information that you can, it's like a 3 or 4 page document. And here's just some pictures to show you some of those examples I was talking about, the buckwheat, the crimson clover, rolling it down for weed control. Cereal rye is a great one for that, to keep the weeds from growing. So just lots of benefits to cover crops. And this document just kind of gives you a lot of information in just a short amount of pages. So some of the other practices, and I'm, because of time, I'm not going to take a lot of time to go through all of them, but I wanted to highlight a few that, small scale producers usually are interested in. And high tunnels, of course, is one of our big ones for small scale producers. We've started this about 2010, I believe. So here about 13 years we've been doing it. And it's been, in Kentucky, we always have more applications than we can fund. Basically, it's just a greenhouse that you're growing your garden inside of. The main difference, you're growing in the ground. Where in a greenhouse, you might be growing in pots or on tables. So that's kind of the way I distinguish the two. And so you can do raised beds in there. These requirements here I'm listing is if you decide to do financial assistance with us. These would be the things you'd have to follow. But 12 inches, you could have the raised bed up to 12 inches as long as you're still growing in the ground. You have to have at least one layer of plastic. You have to use a manufactured kit. So it has to be, we don't have a specs as far as other than that, and you just install it or have somebody install it by those specs. It has to be at least 6 foot tall. Then And then, of course, it has to be used for its intended purpose. If we're paying for it for 5 years at least, that's the lifespan of the practice. You can't use it for other purposes like storing equipment or livestock in it. Some other things you can do with high tunnels is, of course, your roof runoff structure. And that's showed there in that picture. You've got a gutter, you're collecting that water. That could create a problem, right? If the water's running off, before it may have infiltrated in the ground, now it's coming, hitting that hard surface and running off to the side. And plus you need the water for irrigation maybe inside. So those are some other practices: micro-irrigation, mulching, and cover crops. Here's just a picture showing the roof runoff structure. So what you see there is some polyethylene tanks, 750-gallon tanks that you catch the water in off the roof. And then you can in turn take that water, whether through gravity fed or possibly with a pump, and put it in through drip tapes inside the high tunnel. And that way you can be able to grow the crops in there and have the water needed. Here's an example of mulching. So we got two kinds of mulch in this picture. You've got the straw mulch there in the rows to help keep weeds down. And then the actual strawberries are grown in a plastic mulch. And so it's also for weed control and keep the water from evaporating as quickly. So you're conserving your water usage. So that's just a few examples of technical assistance. And of course, we would need that regardless of whether you do financial assistance or not. But there's also financial assistance programs that you might be interested in. And so here's the 5 steps to getting that financial assistance. Steps 1 and 2, reality, they go together hand in hand. Step 1 is what I've been describing, right? The technical assistance, getting the conservation plan. And then step 2 is the application for the program. Well, in reality, a lot of times we end up doing those about the same time. You might come to the office and you tell us you're interested in something. Most likely we'll go on and take an application, and then we'll develop the conservation plan as part of servicing the application. Step 3 is eligibility. Each program has a certain amount of eligibility in it. Maybe how much money you make, or are you following conservation compliance if you're growing crops? Do you have a resource concern? So there's different rules. So we just have to make sure you're eligible before we proceed to step 4. And then step 4 is ranking the application. And basically we just answer a bunch of questions about what you've got going on, what kind of resource concerns we're addressing with your practices, and you get a ranking score. And then we work down from the top of the list till we run out of funds. That's how we determine who gets funded. And then step 5 is basically implement. You find out you're funded, and then we work up a contract, and then at that point, give you the information to implement that plan and get you paid. So I also wanted to bring up, in the Farm Bill each time there's different definitions of groups and ability, who can apply, and maybe special considerations. I want to bring this to attention that we do have historically underserved, categories. In the last Farm Bill, these were spelled out to be these 4 groups. As you can see on the slides there, beginning farmer, we're looking at the last 10 years. So that's how we determine if you're a beginning farmer or not. If you filed your taxes for the farm, basically any time in the last 10 years, we look at that as far as verifying it. Limited resource producer, so that's looking at your household income. And so again, we would look at the taxes to verify that the last 2 years. There's a link there in blue. There's a tool you can look up your county to see what that number is, because each county is different, depending on what the poverty level is considered in that county. But usually in my experience here in Kentucky, it's been around $25,000 to $30,000. You have to be under that. And then the veteran farmer, there is 2 ways to meet that criteria. One is if you're a beginning farmer as well as a veteran, or if you're a new veteran, so that means you've just discharged in the last 10 years. There's 2 ways you could qualify as a veteran farmer for our programs. So some of the reasons historically underserved, the benefit of that is that 1, some of our programs you compete against only those kinds of applicants. So if you're a beginning farmer's example, you have a pot of money just for beginning farmers, so it makes it easier to have a chance to get funded. Could be that you also are eligible for an advance payment. So on some of our programs, we can pay you half of your funds up front, so that way you don't have to go out and get a loan. You can take that funds and turn around and be able to purchase, and then we pay the rest of it once the practice was installed. Oh, and the third one was higher payment rates. So on that one, I'll give you an example here in a minute. If you fall into one of those categories, then you get paid a little higher rate, depending on the program. So the first of two programs I'm going to talk about is EQIP, which is Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And basically, the people that can apply for that is if you have an agriculture or forest operation. You don't necessarily have to own the land. You could be a tenant, but you do have to engage in some kind of production. And you also have to have a natural resource concern. Remember I showed you earlier about the soil erosion, the water quality, animals. So you have to have one of those to be eligible for the program. You go to your local website or local office. On the website, you can find out where that is. And we accept applications year-round, but we usually only rank them once a year. So as far as when you can apply, in Kentucky, our last cutoff to rank was November 4th. So that's the ones we've been working on right now, and we're just finished ranking them and letting people know if they got funded. So if you sign up today, it would probably be this time next year before you'd find out if you were funded or not, unless you're eligible for a special pot of money that was announced a few weeks ago. It's part of the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA funds. Those are addressing climate change activities, which is in most cases would either be soil health on cropland, forestry, if you're doing a forest stewardship plan, or some kind of energy conservation. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me afterwards. I'll be back at the booth out back after this talk. But they did have extend an application period till April 21st for that, for EQIP. Otherwise, the rest of the activities we do will be the classic, which will probably be again, like I said, next year. So one thing I did want to bring up, since this is a homesteader symposium, a lot of the times there's the myth that, you have to sell some kind of product to be eligible, and that's just not true for our program. You can just be growing it for yourself. As long as you're producing it, you don't have to sell it. You can give it away, just use it for yourself, but you are eligible for the EQIP program. So just keep that in mind. When we look at EQIP, I talked about pots of money like for beginning farmers. There's also other pots of money for special initiatives. It's really EQIP's this big broad umbrella of things. But there's some examples there. We have some national initiatives like on-farm energy, organic, high tunnel initiative. I mentioned high tunnel practice. So those are all other pots of money you can compete in. So if you submit an application, you might be interested in high tunnels. You might be interested in some forestry stuff, maybe some pollinator habitat. That would all be on the same application, regardless of how many different things you want to do. And then when we rank them, we're ranking them based on whatever you submitted. So if you've got some practices that fit under high tunnel, we'd rank you in the high tunnel initiative. If you have some stuff in wildlife initiative, we would put you under the wildlife. So you might get funded on one and not the other, but it all is part of that same application. I know a lot of times there's confusion about that. And then you can see the state initiatives. There's just some others there. The forestry, there's wildlife stuff, there's irrigation, manure management, and that's not all inclusive. There's lots of others. This map is just showing how NRCS is administered. So we have 12 work units in Kentucky. So you find your county on there, and so those are also fund accounts. So if you're like in Franklin County, you're in the Shelbyville work unit, and so if you submit a crop or pasture type application, you'll be competing just for those same counties in that red color there. Also, each one of those work units has a supervisory district conservationist that's the manager of those counties. So anytime you have concerns or things you want to talk about, always it's a good resource to find them and have that conversation. And here's a list of those conservation practices I was talking about earlier that EQIP has. Again, this is not all exhaustive, but this is just a few of them. I mentioned already like high tunnels and cover crops, but we do a lot of pasture stuff, whether it's watering facilities, livestock pipeline, heavy use areas for winter feeding, seeding practices. And then there's the forest stand improvement, brush management. Bush honeysuckle in this bluegrass area is a bad invasive plant, so we usually prescribe brush management to help pay to treat that as an example. Here I just wanted to provide an example of how we pay in EQIP so you can kind of get an idea if you did decide to go this route. So the first one there is exclusion fence. So exclusion fence is basically we come out and you have concerns about maybe calves getting into a pond or into a stream. And so we could fence that out because there's water quality concerns. And so we would pay you an exclusion fence. And so that rate this year was $2.99 a foot. And then the HU rate, remember a little while ago I talked about historically underserved, they get paid a little bit more. So that rate was $3.58 this year. And we pay you a flat rate regardless of what it cost you. So if it costs you less because you did the work yourself, we're still going to pay you that same rate. We don't base it on your bills. These rates change every year. So next year they'll be adjusted some. Sometimes they don't change much. Sometimes they change a lot. This year they changed quite a bit because of inflation and cost of materials going up. Example, High Tunnel there, which is the next one, it went up about $2 a square foot roughly. The Gothic type there is the one with kind of a pointed to it peak. We recommend that in Kentucky, even though we didn't get much snow this year. Typically we do get those big snows occasionally, and so it's good to have that to shed the snow off so it doesn't collapse. And you can see the payment rate this year was $5.92 a square foot, or $7.11 for HU applicants. Now that last one there, cover crop, I just want to give you an example there of how we're trying to find payment scenarios that fit small scale producers. Traditionally we paid cover crop by the acre, right? Because you had farmers maybe raising 50, 100, 500 acres. Yes? Historically underserved. So earlier when I mentioned like beginning farmer and limited resource, yeah. So that's what the HU rate would be. And so this is an example of a cover crop, where we're doing the small scale payment scenario. So traditionally paid by the acre, as you can see there. Basic, which would be like a cereal rye or wheat, was $62 an acre. Well, a lot of times your small producers, you don't have that big scale, but yet it still costs you quite a bit because you can't spread those costs out over many acres. So they're coming up with payment scenarios that will help small scale producers out better cover their cost and also make it worth more of the time to go through the process of signing an application and doing all the paperwork you have to do when you work with us. So an example there, we have that multi-species cover crop. It's paid by the 1,000 square feet instead of an acre. And so of course there's 43,000 square feet in an acre. So this gives you an idea. You'd multiply that times 43. Now the one thing you have to keep in mind is there's requirements as far as when you can use it. So you can't go out and do 2 acres and get paid that rate. You'd still have to use the acre rate. But it'd be for somebody that's small, I think usually about 4,000 or 5,000 square feet total or less. The other main program we have besides EQIP is CSP, or Conservation Stewardship Program. This one's been growing in popularity over the last few years. It started really gaining traction in 2008 when they kind of revamped it and updated it. And basically what it's doing is it's kind of saying, okay, we want to evaluate your whole operation to see how good a job you're doing with your conservation stewardship. So I talked about earlier about those resource concerns, and I gave you that big list. Well, we would evaluate all those on your land, whether you had crop, pasture, forest, farmstead, whatever. And we'd say, okay, how many of these are you doing a good job with? And then that would help determine, A, if you are eligible, B, will you get funded, and then C, how much will you get paid if you are eligible and get funded. Now, they're 5-year contracts, so they're basically, if you do get funded, you get a 5 years of payment, and you can renew it for another 5 years, and possibly forever, because they just extended that where we could do people another 5 years after that. So, we really don't know how long. As long as you compete for it and you're still eligible and you're willing to do some new things, you could possibly get funded, long time. So one thing that's attractive for small producers is that the minimum size of these contracts is $1,500 a year for 5 years. So that's a $7,500 contract. And I'm going to show you here in a minute what those payments are made of. But that could be a pretty good incentive for somebody that's small and is doing a good job with conservation already. Like I mentioned, you do have to include everything in your operation, which for small producers, that's not usually a big issue. Now the payment's made up of two parts. You see there in part one is the existing activity payment. And so that's what I call reward money for the good job you're doing on your land already. And you can see there's two parts to that. One is I say, okay, are you meeting soil erosion on your cropland? Well, if you are, that's $300 a year you get paid. And so I go through, now not all of them are eligible. They've come up with a list and said these are the ones that get the $300. But you do, that's for a small producer, that's the best way you're going to get your payment. There isn't a per acre part, as you can see there, but you'd have to have quite a few acres for that to really generate more money. Now, the catch, I guess you could say, is that to get part one there, step one, you have to do step two. And step two is you got to do something new on that land use. So, for example, if you got crops and you're growing vegetables and you've not been doing any pollinators, then maybe you could choose to do a pollinator and habit enhancement, be a half-acre planting, and then that would allow you to get that first payment, the $1,500 a year. And, of course, we pay a sum for that pollinator planting as well. And that's just an example. We have a long list of practices or activities that you could do. So that's something that's gaining popularity and something that might be interesting of you. Just like EQIP, we use the same form to sign up for EQIP as for CSP. And you can sign up year-round. Again, we only rank them once a year usually. Just happened to be that today's is the day, the cutoff for CSP. So if that's your lucky day or what, but if it is something you're interested in, you can come back and see me if you think it's something that your operation's ready to tackle, if you think you're doing a good job with your stewardship on your land. But today is the cutoff if you want to be considered for this next ranking. Otherwise, we'll put you in the next go-around if you sign up starting Monday. Now, there is one exception. I mentioned earlier in EQIP, the IRA funds for EQIP. Well, CSP has the same thing. So if you wanted to do some kind of climate change type practices that I mentioned earlier, then that CSP still has 3 more weeks before the deadline of April 21st. And I can help you if you're trying to figure out what the difference is between that. And before I wrap up here, I just wanted to show some resources that I think could be of use as a small-scale producer. These are both USDA-wide. One of them we have out in the booth out here. The one on the left, the Programs at a Glance. And then the one on the right is online as well, the Urban Agriculture Toolkit. But what's nice about those is, I talked about NRCS. We're just one of 29 agencies in USDA. Well, this here gives a lot more about other agencies and what programs they have to kind of get you started about, looking at other things that we can't help you with. And then, of course, we got websites. You got the NRCS website there that's shown. I've got urban agriculture brought up, that section, but there's all kinds of information about all our practices and all the things I've been talking about, along with many, many more items. Farmers.gov is another good website. It's a USDA website. It's a little bit broader, so you're looking at other agencies as a part of that. And the nice thing about it is they're encouraging, if you're somebody that likes to do your business online, you can set up an account, and we're able to do a lot of our transactions, both us and FSA, through farmers.gov. So if you like to sign for your payments or look at your farm maps, there's lots of things you can do, and they're adding more features all the time. So it's basically kind of like a virtual service center where you can take care of your business online if you didn't want to come to the office or couldn't. And then there, if you're interested as far as trying to find your local office, farmers.gov does have a place on the front page. If you scroll down to the bottom, find your local service center, and you just put in your county and state, and then they'll show you, where your local office is for FSA, NRCS, and others, rural development. And so that way you'll know who to contact and where to go. And there's my contact information there. So have any questions?
As far as the aid, is there a taxable income, or how does that work?
All right, so the question was about if you get aid as far as if it's considered taxable or not. So we have a 1099 form that we send out for any of our grants that you get. And so you take it to your tax person, and sometimes you can get exemptions from having to pay tax on it, sometimes you can't. So it's just a case by case.
So you talked a little bit about exclusion fencing. So if you were to get assistance or a loan, would this only cover, it wouldn't cover boundary fencing around the property, only around waterways, is that correct? Or would it take care of boundary fencing as well?
No, yeah, NRCS, our programs do not cover perimeter fence, like around your property. There's two types of main fence. We do exclusion fence, like I mentioned earlier, fencing them out of streams or woods. And we also do rotational grazing fence. So if you're wanting to rotate more often, we can take one big field and like split it into 4 parts, allow your livestock to rotate. So we do cover that as well.
I'll add something to that real quick. Check in with your local extension office, because there's county ag improvement program funds for that, as well as the state cost share. And both of those will cover perimeter fencing, and I think they're both typically 50-50 cost share.
My turn.
I think so.
Probably a couple of questions. In the when you were talking about applying, you said you would put everything on one application. Would that include both the USDA or the, national and state, or do you have to apply for each of those separately?
No, it's just one application.
Okay, if you've filled out an application and come back later and say, oh, could I apply for this too, can you apply a second time?
Yeah, so it depends on the status of that first application. If it's still active, then you can just tell them, hey, I want to add these other practices that I'm interested in. If the application is no longer good, maybe it was canceled or something, you'd have to sign a new one. So it just depends on the status of that first application. Anybody else?
Are there size restrictions on the piece of land, property, farm, whatever there is? Are there size restrictions? Can it be a quarter of an acre urban piece of land, or could it be, or does it have to be 5+ acres, 10+ acres, et cetera?
No, there's no size restriction. Right now, I've seen people do as small as like 1/100th of an acre. That's I guess you could say, the only reason that's the minimum is because that's as small as the software allows us to make you have to have a farm number with FSA, and that's as small as they can put it in the system. But yeah, I've got people I'm working with right now on equip contracts in Lexington, it's backyard, their house, putting a high tunnel up, pollinator planting, just your typical urban situation. Has anybody in here, got another question here, has anybody in here worked with us as far as doing a contract, or you have? Okay. Okay. Everything went well? Good experience? Good.
Yes, sir. What is exactly this underserved program? What does that consist of? How do you qualify for that? Or
so when you sign the application, it'll have a place on there. You can self-certify. And so there's definitions that go on that form with each one. It'll tell you what the requirements are to meet it. And then if you get funded on some of them, we'll do a check and see, if it's a tax-based one, we'll look at your taxes to verify that you do meet those requirements. Does that cover what you want to know? Okay. Yes.
Is this financial aid available for people, like farmers that live in Puerto Rico?
Repeat that, please.
If this financial aid is available for farmers that live in Puerto Rico? Like in the island of Puerto Rico?
Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
Yes, Puerto Rico is included, yes. Matter of fact, we have I had an intern that worked with me from Puerto Rico. He's down there now doing, he got hired on by us, and is doing an emergency watershed program that we have down in Puerto Rico because of the hurricane damage. So, but yes, they should have the exact same program. Yeah, every area has a little different way they tweak the rules, but they should have the same programs. All right. Anybody else? All right. Thank you all for your attention.